Good evening. Hi, everyone. My name is Amir Dotan. I run StokeNewingtonHistory.com. My talk today is going to be all about architecture and the architects that built Stoke Newington. There are a lot of fascinating buildings around us, pubs, public buildings, municipal buildings, and so on. And I always thought it was interesting to think about the people that designed those buildings and their kind of backstory, and it gives you a newfound appreciation of some of those buildings. Some of them, as you're going to see, are not around anymore. They were demolished. Others are still very much part of the kind of the streetscape that we see every day as we walk down the main roads like Church Street and the High Street. I'm only going to focus on 5. There are many, many others, and really hopefully give you a bit more of an understanding and a sense of who those people were, and a bit more appreciation in some cases about the buildings themselves. The talk will cover 5, I would say 5.5 architects that are associated with some of Stoke Newington's most sort of notable buildings. We're going to start with Sir George Gilbert Scott. We're then going to move on to Frank Matcham. We're going to look at Hobden and Pori, a partnership of 2 architects, before moving on to Arthur Edward Sewell, and finish with J. Reginald Trulove. So I hope to spend a few minutes on each one of those architects. Some of them are more renowned and eminent than others. Others are maybe a bit more obscure. It was more difficult to find information about them, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. The first architect that I'm going to be introducing today is Sir George Gilbert Scott. He's the person that's responsible for one of, I think, the most important landmarks in the area, and that's St. Mary's new church that was built in 1858. So who was Sir George Gilbert Scott? He was a very prolific Gothic revival architect. He's associated mainly with the design, building, and renovation of churches and cathedrals. He actually started his career as a leading designer of workhouses. Over 800 buildings were designed or altered by him. He designed many iconic buildings, including the Midland Grand Hotel and St. Pancras Station and the Albert Memorial in Hyde Park. So let's talk about George Gilbert Scott's contribution in Stoke Newington. Stoke Newington parish has been around for centuries, and it had a very small church that grew and was expanded over the years. This is St. Mary's old church, an Elizabethan church that the Lord of the Manor, William Patten, repaired and extended in 1563, a long, long time ago. And as the parish grew, it kept getting extended and more things were added to it. And even when you look at this old photo, you can see that it's a bit of a Frankenstein. It has all these extensions. I'm not sure how many of them got through planning, but by the 1850s, the parish was too big for this small village, old sort of rural church to accommodate. And there was a need to build a new church that can accommodate that growing congregation. The site that was selected for this new church was actually opposite the old church. Opposite the old church was the old rectory house. That was pulled down in 1855, and the new church was built. Building began in 1855 and was completed in 1858. This is a publication from that year that gives you a sense of the interior and also the exterior. Interestingly, though, even though in this drawing you've got the complete church with kind of the steeple and the spire as well, in reality, for a long time, the church did not have a steeple, as you can see from this photo. And I'm going to tell you in a second why. But despite the design that Sir George Gilbert Scott had, in reality, it was only partially built, as you can see. At the time, this gave rise to this rhyme. Stoke Newington is a funny place with lots of funny people. Thomas Jackson built a church, but could not build a steeple. Thomas Jackson was the rector at the time. But the good news was that in 1890, Sir George Gilbert Scott's son, John Aldred Scott, came to the rescue and designed the steeple and the spire that were added that year. Moving on to our next architect, this is Frank Matcham. He designed a building that's no longer around, but it's one of my favorite buildings, and I refer to it in kind of other talks over the years as well. Frank Matcham specialized in the design of theaters and music halls. If you look at his portfolio, he designed the Hippodrome, the Hackney Empire, the Colosseum, the Palladium, and the Victoria Palace. So he was extremely prolific and is synonymous with those grand theaters that you still see, like the Hackney Empire and places in the West End. And during his 40-year career, he was responsible for the design and construction of over 90 theaters and the redesign and refurbishment of a further 80. When it came to Stoke Newington, he designed the Alexandra Palace in 1897. This was an urban theatre in Stoke Newington Road, sandwiched between Princess May Road and Belgrade Road. The view looks very different now, but this was West End standards, as you're going to see in a minute. It was demolished in 1960, and a block of flats was built on the site. It's called Alexandra Court, so they kept the name. It's hard to imagine that Stoke Newington had its own West End theatre just down the road. I mean, these are drawings that show, the dress circle, the upper circle, the stage, everything. This was your sort of quintessential late Victorian theatre, very similar to the Hackney Empire. This is a sad view when it was being dismantled. It closed in 1950. It went through quite a few changes and different owners over the decades. It, at some point, also became a cinema, but there were also still productions and plays. So quite a few things were going on, not just kind of variety shows as such, but after the war, it was probably difficult to compete with some of the new forms of entertainment. And it was pretty much derelict for 10 years in the 50s until it was demolished. Today, this kind of building would probably be grade 2 listed, maybe preserved, maybe turned into even like a hotel or anything. But I think in the 50s and even in the 60s, there was less maybe appreciation or ability to kind of refurbish and maintain those grand structures. There was always a need for housing, so it was sadly demolished. Next up, we got a partnership. We got two architects. We got Robert William Hobden and we've got Arthur George Pori. They were trading and working under the name Hobden and Pori. I couldn't find the birthday for Hobden, but people did confirm from a number of sources that he passed away in 1921. But as you'll see, all the buildings that I'm going to show you are ones that were built after 1921. So assuming that he did pass away that year, it was really kind of the brand and the name that that was kept by his partner. And they had an interesting contribution to Stoke Newington in terms of just the number of buildings. So just to tell you a bit about them, they were based in 37 Finsbury Square. They designed a number of Art Deco buildings, some in the Egyptian revival style. Pori was actually one of the architects who designed the iconic Carrer's cigarette factory in Camden in 1926 to 28. And they were very prolific in Stoke Newington, which is very interesting. In 1923, they designed the World War I Memorial Hall in Church Street. In 1925, they designed the Library Gallery extension. In 1929, they designed the Simpsons of Piccadilly's clothing factory in Stoke Newington Road. And in 1930, they designed the Clissold Road swimming bath. So I'm quite intrigued as to how they were able, I guess, to operate in the area and be that prolific. I don't know if they had any specific ties to the council or anything like that, but they left their mark in a number of places. The first contribution I'm going to talk about is the World War I Memorial Hall in Church Street on the corner of Edwards Lane. Most of us know it now as the entrance to the library, but it wasn't built as such initially. The library originally was built in 1892 and it had its own entrance. The Memorial Hall was built as a completely standalone building that wasn't connected to the library until 1925. It was built in 1923 and it commemorates the names of 852 Stoke Newington servicemen that lost their life in World War I. This is a photo of the opening ceremony. And as you can see, it was a big occasion. The whole street was filled with people. And when you think about just the sacrifice that Stoke Newington made during the war, and you understand kind of the enormity and the significance of having that memorial hall to make sure that those names are not forgotten. In 1925, Hobden and Pori designed the gallery extension that connected the Memorial Hall with the library. The library was extended on a number of occasions. It was built in 1892. It was then extended in 1904. The gallery extension was in 1925. And we're going to see that our kind of next architect was also responsible for the extension in 1937, when a reference library was added as well. But as I mentioned, Hobden and Pori were very busy bees in Stoke Newington. They also designed the Clissold Road swimming bath, where the leisure center is today. This was built and opened in 1930. These are some of the photos of the interior of the swimming bath. Very different from what we are used to today, I guess, for more kind of modern buildings. The last contribution of Hobden and Pori to Stoke Newington is the very imposing Simpsons clothing factory in 92 and 100 Stoke Newington Road. It was built in 1929 and accommodated 3,000 employees. And it really also represented the kind of the change and kind of the shift in the kind of the population and the trade in Stoke Newington as it moved slightly kind of further away from a very kind of middle class, respectable suburb into a more industrial district, if you like, from the 30s all the way up to the 80s. And this was the epicenter of the rag trade that was booming in Stoke Newington during those decades. Simpsons of Piccadilly was a very famous retail store. When it opened in the 30s, it was the biggest menswear store in Britain. And all those clothes, all those kind of trousers and coats and all those things were manufactured in the factory. Next to architects I'm going to talk about are Arthur Edward Sewell, who designed 2 pubs in Church Street. And we're also going to finish with J. Reginald Trulove, who designed the municipal buildings. So Arthur Edward Sewell, he was the principal architect and surveyor for Truman's Brewery. His career peaked during the interwar period, when brewers really wanted to shed that sort of Victorian image of their pubs for a less rowdy atmosphere. And they kind of went with a design and a concept called the improved pub to really try to appeal more to women. And if you think about the design of some of those sort of interwar pubs compared to the Victorian drinking palaces, they're very different. We're going to see that they were designed with more of a neo-Georgian, neo-Tudor sensibility. Arthur Edward Sewell designed around 50 pubs. 5 of those are now listed buildings. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the Red Lion pub in Church Street. This was the original pub. It was first recorded in 1697. This is the architectural drawing of the old Red Lion, and I'll go into a bit more detail in a second. We can see that it was drawn by Sewell himself, maybe before the pub was demolished, maybe to have a record of what that pub used to look like. When you zoom in, you can see that, like all pubs back then, it was divided into separate rooms. So you had the public bar, the private bar, the saloon, and those really differed in terms of the quality, whether you had sawdust on the floor in the public bar, or you went for the posh saloon where you could sit down and have a meal as well. They had separate entrances. You had these partitions with frosted glass and wood, just to create those much more sort of private inner spaces in the bar itself. This is a view that shows just how narrow Lordship Road was. And the reason why the pub was demolished in 1924 was Lordship Road was being widened. And as a result, the old pub had to be pulled down. So Sewell designed a new pub for the brewery. And this is the Red Lion that we know today. You can see that it used to have the name of the brewery, like a lot of pubs used to. Next up, the second pub that Sewell designed in Church Street. This is the Rose and Crown. The pub that we know and love today was actually built in 1931. There were 2 previous incarnations of that pub. On the left, you can see the very kind of original tavern. It has the date 1806. That tavern was there for many centuries. And on the right, we can see the Victorian version, when the wooden old tavern was pulled down and a new structure was built on the site. And as you can see as well, this is opposite the current site that we know, and I'll explain why in a second. This is the photo that shows us its current location before it was built. You can see the junction was 1 lane wide, very similar to Lordship Road, but by the 20s and 30s, there was an increase in traffic. So some of those old sort of country roads almost had to be widened. And as a result, some of the buildings had to be pulled down. Some of the pavement as well was truncated. This is a drawing that shows exactly what happened. So you can see the old kind of junction with the dotted line, kind of showing what was the available space, and then what was created. And you can see the curved edge of the Rose and Crown as we know it today. You can also see where the pavement is now, where the old pub used to be. These are the architectural drawings of the Rose and Crown. We can see that, as I mentioned, for the old Red Lion, you've got the designation of the public bar, the private, the saloon bar, what's called the outdoor department, which was the off-license bit. So you would go in with a jug, get it filled, and then go home. So it was more of a corridor, whereas now that's the main entrance to the pub. And this is a view of the Rose and Crown, and it was completed in 1931. The last architect that I'm going to talk about is Reginald Trulove, who designed the municipal buildings in Church Street. Those include the Town Hall, the Assembly Hall, and the Reference Library. Reginald Trulove started an independent practice in London in 1911. He was captain in the 21st London Regiment in the First World War. He worked as an assistant architect at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. He designed several military cemeteries in France and actually won 2 competitions in 1928 to design memorials to the missing. And he worked in the War Department in 1940. And I think it was interesting to read a bit about his backstory, and kind of, he's a much more obscure architect compared to some of the others that I mentioned in my talk, but yet his impact on Stoke Newington and Church Street is quite immense. Stoke Newington's original town hall was not in Church Street, it was in Milton Grove. But by the 30s, there was a need, I think, maybe to move it to a more central location, to create this municipal hub next to the library, next to the substation as well. So the site that was selected for the new municipal buildings was this one. This is Church Row, opposite Albion Road, next to the old church. This was a row originally of 9, then 8 grand houses that were built in 1695 to 1700. And that site was cleared to make room for the new town hall. In 1934, there was a competition to design the new town hall. Reginald Trulove submitted the design that you can see on the left, and that was the winning design. And this is the only reason why I found a photo of him from this news clipping that talks about the competition results and him winning it, just to give you a bit of a sense of what the building looked like when it opened. It was obviously cleaner and much tidier than what we know of today, primarily because it doesn't have the camouflage paint that was added in the Second World War. This is a view of the council chamber. And on the right, we have the exterior. This is a photo that shows what it looked like during the Second World War. You can see camouflage paint was painted. There's also a little kind of tower. I'm not sure if that was for kind of air raids or for any other purpose, but we can see that it was very much made to look like a military building. And when you think about Trulove's background as an officer and designing sort of the war graves and so on, the fact that his building was then kind of camouflaged and was sort of transformed to what we see in the photo, I think is quite interesting. These are some of the architectural drawings that you can see at the bottom right corner. We've got his initials. What used to be the recreation room for the staff is now the Hackney Council CCTV Centre. It's also used by the Civil Protection Service. So that's the council's emergency response service. So they use some of the space and the rooms there to store equipment and other things. Just to zoom in on the council chamber, and a nice photo as well that shows how it used to look like when it was in use. That was it. Hopefully you now have a better kind of understanding and a newfound appreciation of some of these buildings, a bit more understanding of the names and in some cases the faces behind them. I think it's really interesting to think about that broader context and a bit of the backstory of those people that created these buildings that are now synonymous with Stoke Newington, very much part of our day-to-day lives. Thank you.